Okay, guys, this is going to be a brief 8-slide um, discussion of how you should approach or conceive of approaching preparing for the midterm. And I think this is just a reasonable way of, you know, uh, preparing for any midterm or final exam or whatever. So it's targeted at our class, but I think there's some lessons of rather general value here. So, but first, a word about a reading that's not, as I say here, required for this course, but which I think all educated persons should, in fact, be familiar with. You'll have this in videotape form, so it'll just play. If it doesn't appeal to you, you're perfectly free to move the video forward to the next slide. But this is some of the very best advice from the late Douglas Adams, the British author, whose famous work, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is having an excerpt read here. I think you'll see the point I'm trying to make, but yeah, here we go.
Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended lifeforms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd, because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some suggested that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. Then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth, England, suddenly realised what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a telephone to tell anyone about it, a terribly stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. It is perhaps the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing houses of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 50 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Oolon Kolufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? And in many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer easterny rim of the galaxy, The Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom. For though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and secondly, it has the words, "Don't Panic," inscribed in large friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house.
So, if you don't know Douglas Adams' five-book, inappropriately labeled trilogy, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it is remarkable. Douglas Adams, British comedic science fiction author, very funny man. Also a pretty keen environmentalist. Passed away of heart attack several years ago, but he's fondly remembered, and particularly for the cover of his book, Bright Friendly Letters Don't Panic. So obviously that's my first message to you. You're in, as we'll note, an upper level course with prerequisites. So you're not rookies. You've got experience. There's nothing. If you're new to the Thailand campus, if you're just visiting for a semester, there's nothing we're doing that's out of the ordinary, or in any way conceptually, functionally different from what you've been doing at other Webster campuses. So just breathe and take the tasks before you one step at a time. Okay, so let's start first with where we've been and what we've seen. So I just, as I said, I point out, right, that this is a 3,000 level course, so it's it's an advanced and tended to be more challenging, difficult course with, as I say, prerequisites, so that everyone in the class is presumed to have a basic grounding in some of the international relations or international politics issues, and also, more importantly, experience with studying and taking exams and all that kind of stuff. So just don't forget that you've already done these things, right? You're not rookies. You've taken plenty of exams. There's nothing about my course that is dramatically different in any functional way whatsoever. So just remember that this is not, you're not new to the game. You're more than capable of doing the work that needs to be done. So let's do kind of just take a quick gander at where we've been, just to kind of help you start the process of getting what I'll mention, discuss a little bit toward the end, the big picture. Because I guess I could say here, you've got really two tasks, or two kind of learning objectives, conceptually and empirically, right? One is to, understand and be able to follow the big narratives that are being weaved in this course, right? Unlike courses that are grounded in a central core textbook, courses that are constructed in the way I've constructed this, with articles and book chapters of my choosing, we can do just more interesting things than you can with a simple textbook. We can, in fact, tell stories. We can establish narratives. We can weave webs of complex information and complex data and complex theorizing over the span of just a few weeks by the reading of select choices from the literature. Okay, so the first several weeks, and as I said in my Facebook Messenger post, this iteration of the course, the historical section of the course, is at least 1 or 2 weeks longer than it was last year, and the number of readings has been reduced by, I guess, about 20%. So I don't think, if you're kind of in the game, as it were, you'll have any trouble. If you've, as I kind of put out on the first day, my reading levels, well, I mean, I don't think they're actually heavy anymore. I have kind of followed the suggestions and advice of Ken and have reduced to some degree across all my classes the reading level, of the load of reading. So I don't think that, but even still, even at this lower level, the advice I gave on day one is still good, right? If you tackle the reading, like one article a day, 3 over a week or something, it's no big deal. It's no big deal at all. It's completely manageable. It would be manageable by a high schooler. If, however, you wait until the morning of class or the night before class to read 3 peer-reviewed articles, then it's more challenging. And if you have actually waited until the weekend before the midterm to do the reading for this whole section, you have indeed a very, very steep hill to climb. And there's just not a lot I can do about that. If that's your situation, you do have a boatload of reading and a boatload of work to do in the next 48 hours or so. Not saying it can't be done, but it need not be that way. Okay, so we start this course with an inquiry into the history of American foreign policy, and I make the choice, following Mead's advice, that we should start actually at the beginning, unlike 99% of foreign policy textbooks, which start at the modern period, maybe say with Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt. Because I think Mead's right. So, Mead tells us that there are important lessons for today in an analysis, in an understanding of our foreign policy history, even of the early republic. So, as I suggested in class, we can put Trump, who by all appearances seems to be something of a disturbed man, but in terms of foreign policy, making massively important foreign policy announcements at 3 a.m. by Twitter without having been advised or having let his advisors know, and seemingly, I think more to the point, taking us in radically new directions without apparently much thought at all. That's not to say, however, that the questions that he's responding to in what most people observe to be erratic and irrational, and some are actually concerned quite mentally ill ways, the questions themselves are, in some ways, many of them perennial, right? They're questions, as Mead points out, that have been asked since the beginning of the Republic. Just different presidents have answered them different ways, particularly over time as dominant hegemonic ideas about economics, politics, democracies, rights. As those things change, so do our foreign policy posture, our grand strategies. So we had an early foreign policy over 2 weeks. I think that's one place where I added a week. And so we start with the readings by Mead, Deutsch, which actually might seem curiously fit in that first week, because he's talking about the hegemony, the effort or the desire or the long-standing, liberal international impulse in American foreign policy, dating back to at least Wilson, that has caused us so much trouble because we always want to do these big things but don't want to put any bucks behind it. I have issues with some of his arguments, but it's a good, it follows Mead in the sense that if we're starting to discuss Wilsonianism and liberal internationalism, then Mead has a discussion of the very earliest foreign policy figures like Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary. Then Deutsch begins our conversation, at least, on Wilsonianism, liberal internationalism, and then the Kennan document, of course, is that critically important piece that establishes the foundation for the containment doctrine that prevailed for the whole of the Cold War. The second part of the early foreign policy segment Schlesinger revisits the reasons why we had the Cold War and offers a very different explanation from the one would derive from reading Kennan. And we talked about that in class, kind of spheres of influence thinking versus universalist thinking on the American side. The Fisher piece tells us some interesting, and for me, the first time I read it, some surprising things about the Reagan administration and the ending of the Cold War. And the reputation that Reagan still enjoys as having been an 8-year hard ass is not borne out in that sense, or by the data that Fisher explores, and noting that really it was Reagan who made some of the most important first moves towards what Nixon would have called détente or something, the kind of a softening of our posture, opening up the possibility, opening the door to nuclear arms reduction treaties, and then the Ignatieff piece is that profoundly disturbing piece written on the eve of Bush's war on Iraq, making the call that we have this burden that is ours alone because we are the hegemonic power to do things that the American empire has to do to make the world safe for democracy and removal of tyrants. It's a terrible piece in many respects, or it's certainly normatively awful. I think the values embedded in it are terrible, but I think it's an important piece to read. And Ignatieff has apologized for it profusely, but only after the war went so terribly wrong. Then we move into historical context number 2, the post-Cold War period of ontological insecurity to the period of primacy, right? And the readings for that, right? Brinkley's discussion of Clinton's search for a doctrine in hopes of kind of replicating the Kennan magic. The Power and Mandelbaum pieces, if you remember, are, I kind of juxtaposed those two. I chose those two pieces because they are very easily juxtaposed into the form of a debate, right? We've got Samantha Power railing against U.S. foreign policy and the Clinton administration in particular for their abject failure to do anything to save the 800,000 innocents who were slaughtered in Rwanda. And against that, Mandelbaum didn't write it for Power, but at the same time, roughly the same time, you have this conservative realist foreign policy scholar at Johns Hopkins talking about Clinton foreign policy as an effort to turn the work of foreign policy into social work. So the very opposite of what Power would, who's calling for, the use of American power for humanitarian purposes. Mandelbaum considers that to be wholly out of the purview of responsible foreign policy. So we get that debate or clash of narratives I was talking about that is part and parcel of that whole 90s period of ontological insecurity that I spoke of. And then we move into historical context 3, post 9/11, right? And here we see some pretty consistent criticisms of the Bush administration. Deller and Burroughs talk about essentially the abandonment of a responsible approach to arms control, and the terms in there that if you've kept up with the reading, and these will sound familiar, the non-proliferation approach versus they replaced that with the counter-proliferation approach, which is unsuccessful for many reasons, and you ought to know that. Greg, the article Crafting a a better grand strategy. The post-September 11 world compares, I think, very usefully the way in which President Truman went about as like the first architect of the containment doctrine, setting up a complex array of institutions, principles, practices, policies for containing the Soviet Union. It was not a mere sole reliance on military power. It was a grand strategy that was appropriately complex, employing, as we'll explore later in the course, all of the many varied instruments of U.S. foreign policy, from soft power, public diplomacy, up the line to hard power, nuclear brinkmanship, as opposed to George W. Bush's grand strategy in the global war on terror, which is, in their view, and I think well established basis for making that claim, is a singularly militarized, uniquely or singularly militarized grand strategy. They pay some lip service in some of their Defense Department documents, but the evidence is pretty clear that they relied almost exclusively on military power to prosecute the global war on terror, and as a result of the lack of complexity and the lack of a variegated application of instruments available to the president, it's been a doctrine that failed, whereas the containment doctrine eventually seems to have won the day. Then there's McKeon, who talks about, from a kind of constructivist perspective, the kind of horror for the world watching when the state that had done more than any other state in the world to help advance the cause of a torture norm, meaning making torture unthinkable, getting it established as a principle of customary law, from which, as we say, it's a jus cogens norm. It's a norm so deeply entrenched that there is no circumstance under which retrenchment or abrogation or sidestepping the norm is acceptable. It was that deeply embedded as a norm, a jus cogens norm. And then Bush and John Woo and those guys just trashed it. So it's a very significant moment in foreign policy. And we also learned some things about how norms work. Then the Kruger piece, the kind of very critical take on Obama foreign policy. Actually, he's very critical of it. He pulls no punches in the end and declares it all largely the Obama foreign policy is largely a failure, and in several of his respects. Anyway, I certainly concur. But he does a very nice job of laying the groundwork as to why Obama adopted the approach that he had approached, and that was really the god-awful economic circumstances that he inherited, the Great Recession, and a nation that was war-weary. So there were very few alternatives to the Obama approach of kind of outsourcing our fighting to agents on the ground that we could find and work with. So that takes us up to the kind of the present period. I don't have anything for you on Obama. I'm sorry, on President Trump. To be honest, he has proven to be so hard to write about for scholars of foreign policy because he is so erratic and he is so seemingly unstable that it's hard to pin down and talk about a Trump foreign policy in any conceptual, generalizable way, because it can change at 3 o'clock in the morning on a dime. And so there's not much of real good conceptual theoretical value written yet on the Trump foreign policy. So Perhaps in another year's time, we'll start to see more of that emerge. Um, then that takes us to this, this week and last. We got caught up and then handled the international relations theory opening salvo, the September 30th, and were intended, obviously, to treat that last minute change from just doing realism applied to foreign policy decision making to 3 articles, one from the 3 broad approaches. Mearsheimer's short piece on China, Legro's constructivist analysis of what the rise of China means, and Eikenberry's liberal analysis of what the rise of China means. We're not going to test on that. We're not even going to test on the international relations theories of September 30th that we did go over. So right now, and you heard this through the Facebook Messenger group, right now the test is just about those. Okay, that's that, and that's why I said earlier that's when we should have had the midterm, but I had to wait until the 8th week. Okay, all right. So midterm Monday, then fall break. All right. So what about the exam? Okay, so the structure of the exam. The basic advice here, as I say here, be sure to do all that I ask for each section, the 2 sections, the ID section and the essay section, and for each item in the ID section or question in the essay section, right? And my admonition has always been count the question marks, or sometimes bullet points, or sometimes you just kind of have to read it and figure out how many things am I asking you to do. If we look at this first page of a midterm exam from last year's Contemporary American Politics topics course that I did, Liberal Democracy and Donald Trump and the Age of Populism, you will have a document that looks exactly like this, right? You will have the top section, this is the ID section. You'll have to choose 2 from one column and 3 from another, don't matter which way. And again, just tell me what the concept means, right? And tell me, secondly, how it matters or how it's significant to our study in that class of liberal democracy in America. So the terms will be obviously from our course, and so you will tell me what the term or name that you've chosen to identify means or what it represents. And then you go on to the second or third sentence, and that's really all you need. There's 1, 2, 3 sentences here. Tell me how that concept or person or whatever that you've just identified has proven or has been shown to be significant to our study of foreign policy. If you don't do both of those things, you can't get 5 points. If you do only one of the 2 things and you do it really well, you'll get 2.5 points. But 2.5 out of 5 is a 50%, so you'd fail that answer. So be sure to do both things for each of the 5 terms you choose. Fair enough? Pretty straightforward. Secondly, then you go into the essay section, right? And you'll see that there'll be pairs of essays that you can choose from, and then one question that everybody has to do. In this exam, everyone had to write on the first essay question, and it was followed by 2 pairs that they could choose from. Now, you'll just notice that sometimes it's easier the way the question just gets worded to identify or count the question marks, as it were. I mean, in this question, it's a bulleted list, or it's a numbered, lettered list of sub-questions, right? So instantly, you can see that there are 4 things I'm asking you to do in that question. Make sure you take the time before you start writing to think about each one of those 4 so that you address them all when you finish. Okay? If you do 3 of the 4, and you do 3 of the 4 very, very well, that is still only going to give you, a 75% on a question that you were gunning towards 100 on, right? Because you just didn't do the fourth part, right? So that's why I say count the question marks, count the bullet points, whatever. Just be very clear on how many things I'm asking you to do and what those things are, all right? We'll go to the next page of this exam. And there's some commonality, there's kind of common format to my questions, right? If you take question 3 here, that green box is surrounding some basic textual setup, right? It kind of lays the premise for the question. It's often intended to remind you of some specific readings or some specific conversations that we had, so I can kind of try to sink into your brain, you know, the cues that I want you to follow in answering the question. So there's some introductory discursus. Then there's usually a statement that kind of sets up the 2, 3, 4 elements that you're required to address. So that purple, right, is telling you I'm interested in the general concept pardon me, of backsliding in light of what's in that green box, right? In light of the well-documented concerns about this growing democracy deficit, the real challenges to liberal democracy from the Philippines through Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and now in the United States. And then the 4 lettered bullets, right? So, 3 lettered bullets. So you know instantly there are 3 things you need to talk about, and they are all about explaining what that concept of backsliding means in the context of our course. Simple enough. Just do that, you'll be fine, right? The next essay question, same structure, right? I mean, we've got kind of that introductory discursus according to Kazmuda. You know, defining populism is problematic. It's kind of an empty bucket, he says. Then there's some underlined green text here that kind of gives you a little more to chew on to try to, what I'm trying to do there is give you more hints or more verbal reminders of what it is that we've talked about, so that when you get to the next bit, the actual prompt, you'll hopefully have been put into the place where you can answer that question, right? So in that question, you can see it's really small text, but it comes down to you have to do 3 things. That's that circled one, right? The question is about the kind of styles of populist leadership, and Muda identifies 5 of them. In class, we collectively identified at least 4 of Muda's 5 that seem to fit Trump pretty well. And in this test question, I'm asking them to just give me 3 of the 4 that we identified of the 5 that Muda lists as possible leadership styles for populist leaders. So how many things did he do in there? 3. Name and explain how 3 styles of populist leadership fit President Trump. Okay. The next essay question, same structural format, right? Introductory discursus, kind of leading you into the stuff I want you to do. That's also functioning as to, in a way that kind of reminds you of the specific literatures that we read, that you've read, so that you kind of know where to kind of go in your mind to answer the question that's coming, right? This one talks about, the degree to which it's actually a central question of the course, right? Is the Trump populism, given in the introductory discursus there, populism has been shown to be by itself neither injurious or harmful to liberal democracy or corrective or helpful to liberal. By itself, it's kind of neutered, right? It only takes on meaningful form when it gets attached to other ideological elements. it becomes left-wing populism, right-wing populism, fascist, white nationalist populism, whatever. Once it gets attached to another ideological framework, then we can say something about it with respect to how it relates to liberal democracy. Essentially, is that form or this form of populism generally a threat to liberal democracy or not? So this question kind of takes you down that road, and the question then is, so how many things am I asking you to do in question 5, right? I've circled the word first, and I've circled the word second. So on first blush, you might think, okay, yep, there's 2 things here, okay? But you'd be wrong, right? It's asking for 3 things, right? It just doesn't have a thirdly kind of word, right? What it has is, first, describe the ideological content of Trump's brand of populism. And then second, it says, assert an opinion about the course's central question. Is Trump's brand of populism a threat to liberal democracy or not? That's not the end, because the next sentence, though it doesn't have thirdly or whatever, it says, it tells you if your answer to number 2 is yes, it's a threat, then you need to support that by the hows and whys, right? Drawing on course material, lecture, reading, and whatever, to support the case that Trump's brand of populism indeed seems to pose a pretty significant threat to the liberal element of American liberal democracy. If your answer is no, it does not, you can't leave it there either. So I ask you to essentially, if you don't think it is, how do you respond to the arguments that seem pretty persuasive to a lot of people that he is, or it does, right? That we've read. So if you have concluded that, this is the final exam actually, if you've concluded after 16 weeks that Trump and his form, particular brand and style of populism doesn't pose any threat to American liberal democracy, then you got to answer these well-considered voices that have made some compelling arguments as to why he is, right, and his followers are, right? People like Jeffrey Isaac at Indiana, who former editor of Dissent magazine. I mean, these super influential and smart people who have very strong cases to make that Trump in fact does represent a threat. So again, that's 3 things, right? That third element is contingent upon whether the answer, the second bit is a yes or a no, right? But nevertheless, there are 3 things there that you need to do, and if you don't do all 3, you'll fall short of the mark. Okay, how should you prepare for the exam, right? Or any exam, frankly, right? Well, I'm going to kind of suggest a scenario, and I've had this talk with some of you in the hallways or whatever. Here's what I suggest, right? Unlike a course, as I say here, that relies on a core textbook, the readings that I have chosen for you, for your study of foreign policy, all kind of tell a story in some fashion, right? They all have a unique story to tell, right? But they're not unconnected, right? So though each of them makes an argument or advances a hypothesis or a thesis or a theoretical statement of some sort, right? You need to know what that is, right? For every one of the articles, right? And again, the number of articles that you're responsible for isn't all that high if you've been keeping up. If this is your weekend to start studying, start actually beginning the course, then yeah, it's a hell of a lot of reading, and you won't likely get it all done. But the first task is to identify for each article what that central argument is, or that thesis. And hopefully all you're having to do is like just remember when you pick it up and go, oh yeah, this is about that thing. So hopefully you're just having to refamiliarize yourself with the central arguments of these readings, right? And then what I suggest, I really do, I don't know if they sell them in Hua Hin, but I suggest note cards. I know it's old school, and I'm not an old school guy when it comes to, I prefer tech. But there is something about writing on cards that is good for the memory. So you can do it this way, literally, or you can do it in some facsimile of this practice, right? So good practice would be to, once you have skimmed the article and remembered or seen in your notes in the margins of what the general argument or thesis is in that paper, you jot that down on an index card. And that's the only thing you put on that index card. And you just set it down. Take up another one, another article, and do the same thing and write the thesis of the argument on an index card. Set it down. Grab another and do it, and do them all, right? Just writing in one or two sentences the central argument or thesis of each assigned reading. If you do just that and nothing else, and you know what the central arguments of all of the pieces are, and you can sort of follow those or connect those into the, I guess most of you are downloading the PowerPoint presentations, and can reasonably connect them together, you're going to be 60, 70% of the way there, right? Possibly into a C range, having done just that bit of work, right? But I, suggest you not stop there, right? And you would also kind of imagine, like, if you literally do print them out, then, and if you got room in your, if you got space in your room, you're just going to lay them all out on the floor with that index card on top of each one. And then start picking up the articles again. And you'll remember that each one of these is conveniently organized in subsections identified by subtitles. So go through those subsections, just hopefully having to just skim because you read it and taken notes on it and highlighted and all that stuff the first time. So that all you have to do is just kind of jot down some key terms and some key data points, maybe 2 or 3 cards for that section. And then do the next section, and you might end up with maybe 6, 9 cards total for that article. And then set it down. Okay? Grab another and do the same thing, right, with the next one, and the next one, and the next, right? So you end up with maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cards. Each one doesn't have a lot on it, remember, right? But 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 cards for each article. And if you know the details of those cards, right? You are 75, 85% of the way there. You know a great deal more than you have some of you have expressed fear about. So now the next step is oh well, I've kind of already made this point, right? That follow the kind of substance of the argument, filling in the next card, right? And as I say, once you get to that point, you'll have gone a long way toward getting the grade you're shooting for. Then the last thing you do, right, is try to get a sense of the big picture, right? Or actually both things. The stuff of section 2, the essays, and the stuff of section 1, the identifier terms. In other words, you want the big picture and details, right? So remember the 2 sections of the test serve different pedagogical functions. The ID section tests the breadth, the broadness of your knowledge, not how much you know about Anthony Lake, right? Just that Anthony Lake was Bill Clinton's national security advisor, who was the central character of the article on democratic enlargement, the search for a containment doctrine replacement. Right? You don't have to know that he went on to become executive director of UNICEF or any of that, but you do need to know that he was Clinton's national security advisor given the responsibility for that search for a replacement for containment, right? That's breadth of knowledge. You kind of can recognize Anthony Lake. You can't tell me a whole lot about him other than, oh yeah, he Clinton's national security advisor. And even if you don't remember national security advisor, but like, oh yeah, he was the White House staffer working for Clinton, trying to find a term that would capture Clinton's doctrine. There were somebody called Clinton sweepstakes, or whatever. That kind of stuff. Not deep, but the fact that you can pick Anthony Lake out of a list of 10 possible terms tells me the breadth of your knowledge is sound. Okay? The essays test just the opposite, the depth of your knowledge. Right? That's why there's like 3, 4, 5 bullet points in each one. How deep can you go into an explanation or exploration of a problem, right? So the last step here then is putting the individual articles and the arguments and their sub-elements into some grand picture, some grand dominant narrative or set of narratives. One might identify maybe 2, 3, 4 threads of narrative weaved through the first 6 or 7 weeks here, right? That's what you're trying to do in this last step is to try to start connecting these individual, discrete, autonomous articles and integrate them into a narrative package. And re-articulate the narratives we've been exploring in this class, right? So as I say here, as you browse the stack of cards, don't let the cards get mixed up with other articles, but you want to be able to connect the articles, the cards from one article to the details and information on the cards of other articles, particularly if you can do that across topic weeks. Right? So if there's something about Kennan, the Kennan article that you can make a connection to in, say, something from the post-Cold War period, like Clinton or Bush, then you're doing something very significant and moving you towards the the B range of the grade, right? What you're doing are making connections across concepts, across problems, across theoretical concerns, and that's again grappling with the major narratives of the course, right? So when you see similar concerns addressed in separate sections of the course, you're making connections. These are the links, I say here, that constitute the overarching narrative we're pursuing in this section of the course. Right? So if you know both the details of your cards and can see how they are connected to other stacks of cards or discussions in PowerPoints from topics 2 weeks apart, then you have both breadth and depth of knowledge, and you're going to do fine. Okay? You're going to do fine. You see the big picture as well as the fine details. You see the forest as well as the trees. So, do that, and you'll ace the midterm. Okay? It's as simple as that. Now, I say it's as simple as that. There's a difference between simple, antonym, complex, and easy, right? I mean, it's not easy to do this if you are just starting this process of like familiarizing yourself with the reading. If you haven't done the reading yet, then you now have a simple task made heavy and a relatively easy task made complex, because it's all going to be kind of hard to sort through in the very few hours you have left. But if that's you, if you're in that boat, and hey, I went to college, it's not like I didn't, from time to time wait until the last minute to prepare for an exam. The final advice then is just do not forget the best advice that Douglas Adams has to offer. And that's not to panic. All right? Okay. If you have questions, let me know. Ciao.